Woman, an in-depth exploration of the world of women today with Sandra Elkin.
Good evening and welcome to Woman. Tonight, more talk on food and food additives. With me is Beatrice Trum Hunter. Beatrice is one of America's foremost food experts. Her latest book is Food Additives and Federal Policy, The Mirage of Safety. Beatrice, welcome once again.
Good to be here.
Listen, I've lost my appetite since the last time we talked.
That's not my purpose. What I want to do is to enlighten you and others and then have you make wise food choices, but don't give up eating.
I'm worried about having to go into the supermarket. I mean, the choices are so difficult, and I feel, and I'm sure lots of other people feel, a tremendous lack of information. I mean, are there any rules of thumb?
Well, Nicholas Johnson says if you can't pronounce it, don't eat it. This may not be very scientific, but it is a rule of thumb. Because, of course, we are made up of chemicals, and food is made up of chemicals, and some of them do have long terms. So this in itself should not frighten us. But I think that the more you study this whole question of food additives, the more you realize that you can avoid a great many of them if you shun the highly processed foods and get back to the basics. And there we do have a choice. You can put into your basket the baking potatoes, and you can leave out of your basket the potato chips or the instant mashed potatoes or the French fries. And, excuse me, you can use the fresh meats, and you can leave out the luncheon meats. Put in the natural cheeses and leave out the imitation cheese food spreads. Use the milk and not the non-dairy creamers. The butter, not the margarine. You can go down the list. You do have a choice.
As you were talking, I was thinking of all the things in my kitchen cupboards.
Yes, go home and throw them out.
Right, exactly.
Well, do it gradually, you know, because you're not going to create revolution in your family if you go about these things very slowly rather than drastically. But get rid of one thing at a time even, and soon you'll find that it's much easier really to shop with the basics.
Do you think that the convenience foods really are that convenient?
No. To me, this is sheer myth. We've been brainwashed to think that we are saving a great deal of time when, in essence, we're not. Even those people who use things such as television dinners still have to prepare a salad, right? And it seems to me that it takes very little time to scrub a baking potato and to stick it in the oven, or to trickle some brown rice into the pot and let it cook. It may take time to bake the potato or to cook the rice, but the actual preparation time is not long.
We talk about choices a lot on this program and women's movement and lots of other places, but we seem not to have a choice when it comes to the food additive. I mean, it seems as if the choices are being made for us, and we can't choose between the risks and the benefits.
Well, we do have a choice if we stick to the basic commodities. I think that this is the whole point. We don't have a choice if we're going to use the highly processed foods, and unfortunately many Americans are making very poor food choices. It's been estimated that more than 50% of the food choices now for Americans are from the highly processed foods, and this is being projected to be much greater as time goes on. I find this very alarming, because among these highly processed foods, we're also getting a lot of imitation foods. In restaurants, for example, these days, there's very little tomato in the tomato sauce, or cheese in the cheese sauce. They're imitations. There's very little chocolate left. It's counterfeit chocolate. And unfortunately, we don't recognize this because we don't know. The menu doesn't tell us. I have found in ordering things such as sliced turkey sandwiches recently. I open up the bread and there's no sliced turkey. It's pressed turkey loaf. I send it back to the kitchen. Do you?
No, I never have, but I'm very annoyed when I don't get
If enough people would send the things back and say, this is not what the menu says, I think we would get a change. Now, I think that the same thing is true on the marketplace. If we do not buy the highly processed foods, the food processors themselves will get the message. If we demand that foods be produced without the artificial colors and flavors, we'll get these things. There are a number of foods that are now being put on the market being advertised as being natural with no artificial colors or flavors. And I think that this is very encouraging. It's also a reflection of the great work of Dr. Feingold, who's worked with these hyperkinetic children, and he's found that these children who are so terribly active and restless, and they are, difficult to deal with both at home and in the school. And he finds that if he simply has them on a diet without any artificial colors or flavors, many of them lose their hyperkinetic state.
What about pregnant women? I mean, it must be especially difficult.
It is.
For a pregnant woman, too.
It is. Years ago there was this false belief that the placenta of the pregnant woman was such that no poisons passed from her body into the developing embryo. We now see that this is nonsense. It's quite the contrary, actually, because most of the poisons and many of the substances that she takes into her body actually do pass through the placenta into the developing embryo. And in terms of the food additives, things such as sodium nitrate and nitrite pass through very readily. Caffeine, which is added to cola drinks as well as being in coffee and tea, passes through very readily. Many of the artificial colors and flavors pass through readily. And they deposit either in the organs or the tissues of the embryo, and we really don't know what the long-range effects of these are. We have suspicions, though. At crucial stages during pregnancy, the first few weeks are very crucial, and very often there are fetal deaths from assault of toxic materials. At a later stage in the developing embryo, the embryo may be brought to term with birth, but we have a number of birth defects in this country of the type that we really don't know what the origin is, but chemicals are suspected. Now, of course, food additives is only one group in this much larger group of chemicals.
Pesticides would be another one.
Yes, and poisons in the air and in the water, in the environment. And this is why I think that we must take a closer look at food additives, because they are part of the larger problem of chemicals in the environment. There are estimated to be about 10 to 20,000 chemicals that are in the daily environment of Western man. And this is a huge body burden. And cancer experts now are of the opinion, it's a consensus of opinion, that about 80 to 85% of all cancers are induced from things outside of the body, chemicals and radiation. Now, this should give us pause in terms of the food additive problem.
Last week we talked a little bit about DES,
Yes.
which is a synthetic sex hormone. It's diethylstilbestrol. I
Yes.
think. Now, there's a tremendous concentration, supposedly, I've heard, in liver, and pregnant women eat a lot of liver. Now, does that mean that a pregnant woman shouldn't eat liver?
Well, it's a pity to give up liver because it's such a marvelous food in terms of its nutritional value. I think everyone has to decide for himself or herself whether the person does continue eating liver. If the decision is yes, to continue eating liver, then there is a good solution, and that is to choose either baby beef liver or calf's liver. This would be from the young animal, and the young animal has less of an accumulation of any of the toxins than an older animal. So this is a very practical sort of solution.
You say in the book that you think that we've only discovered the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely.
And then, talk about thousands of chemicals already. And
Yes.
it just seems incredible to me that it could get worse.
Yes, there are a number of chemicals about which we have only great suspicions because the conditions which they may trigger have a long period of latency, such as cancer, which is only manifested perhaps 10, 20, 30, or 40 years later. And it's very difficult to pinpoint the cause and effect. Look at how difficult it has been to pinpoint smoking and lung cancer. Well, it's even more difficult with the food additives. But some of the additives do cause allergic reactions, and these are readily seen. Here, many allergists have pinpointed them. The antioxidants, BHT and BHA, have been pinpointed with many allergic reactions. Monosodium glutamate causes the so-called
That's called the Chinese
restaurant syndrome, right? Benzoate of soda, cyclamate, saccharin, all of these have produced allergic reactions.
And will that get worse, do you think? I mean,
Yes.
is it going to be a cumulative thing?
Absolutely. Allergists say that in America today about half of the population suffers from some degree to some allergy, not all from food additives, but from some allergic reactions. And about this, perhaps 10% suffer to such an extent that they're really incapacitated. They simply can't function. Now, many of these people who suffer allergic responses to food additives are like the canaries that used to be taken down in the mine with the miners because they would keel over before the miner was aware of the fact that there were noxious gases. The people who suffer from these food additives are suffering from something that probably we're all suffering from, except that it takes a longer time to develop, or it requires larger amounts for the rest of us to suffer the effects. They are like the canaries.
Well, all of these things are, in the food we eat, but supposedly the Food and Drug Administration has set levels, safety levels. In other words, there's a certain amount in each. You're
Yes.
just smiling.
Yes, Virginia.
I've done it again, right?
Yes, there is no Santa Claus. These so-called safety levels are part of this Mirage of Safety. The title is well chosen. And the toxicologists themselves are very aware of the fact that these so-called safety factors are really not as safe as people have thought they would be. Sometimes the substance cannot even be tested low enough to see the biological damage. We know that the biological damage can perhaps be at parts per trillion, and the testing is only sensitive to parts per billion, which may seem very sensitive. Years from now, that will probably be considered a very crude kind of testing. Then there is a safety factor of 100-fold safety factor, which if it's harmful to the animal, then there's a multiplication so that in terms of the amount that people will eat. But even this 100-fold safety factor is not always necessarily a 100-fold safety factor. In cases, for example, with cyclamates, it was much lower. And with red number 2, it's much, much lower than that. So that we don't have these safeguards.
Well, we talk about thresholds a lot.
Yes.
I mean, do we know in fact that the thresholds exist?
No, we don't. The government is always trying to think in terms of thresholds below which cancer will not be induced, for example. But the cancer people tell us, the experts tell us, that there is no such thing as a threshold. At the present moment, nobody can say what that threshold is, if it exists at all. And the same thing would be true for the substances that have other irreversible types of damage, defective offspring, or genetic mutations, the kinds of things that affect the genetic pool of future generations yet unborn.
Well, who are the people that do the testing?
Well, as we discussed last week, very often the tests are done by independent laboratories for the food interests. And we know that in the past, very often, tests can be arranged in such a way to minimize the effects. For example, species of animals can be chosen which are not particularly prone to tumor formation. Well, if you're trying to show tumor formation, the results may underestimate the problem.
Well, is toxicology really an exact science?
No, toxicologists will tell you that it is not. And the methods that have grown up are largely based on 19th century toxicology, which was used for drug testing. But there are very big differences between drugs and food additives. Drugs are used by a very minor group of people for a limited time, usually for the curing or alleviation of a condition. Food additives may be used by the entire population over a period of a lifetime and with no benefit at all in many instances. The drugs, we know, may interact with one another, so they're always tested with that in mind. With food additives, we may be eating any number of them at the same meal. We have no idea of knowing how they interact with one another. Drugs have to be proven not only safe, but also effective. This is not true with food additives, only safety, not effectiveness. Drugs are always given clinical tests with humans, and it's very rare that food additives are tested this way.
Well, what are the alternatives other than the animal testing? Are there others?
There are some tests with tissue culture which does not make use of animals.
You know, Ashley Montague.
Yes, he was
Talked about
one of
that.
the people who has spoken out for the use of the tissue tests, which he feels can be used instead of the animal test. Animal tests do give us some indication sometimes of harmfulness, and we should never disregard the animal tests. For example, tumor formations or lesions or enlarged organs or lack of reproduction. All of these things should be taken as warning signs. But so often the animal tests do not duplicate what happens with human beings, because the animals are reared in a very controlled environment and they have no stress and they're all homogeneous and they are well fed and well taken care of, and this is not true of the human population. People are under stress and sometimes they're very malnourished. And at different stages of life, we react differently. For example, the newly born may react very differently than an adult to a substance. None of the tests show any allergic reactions. Or for a woman who is pregnant or a person who has just undergone surgery or the elderly, these are all special conditions of stress, and yet there are no testings for these conditions.
What do other countries do? I mean, how do they test and how are they governed?
In many other countries, fewer additives are being used.
I mean, they just plain don't allow them.
Right. Here, for example, we have something like 1,400 different food flavorings alone. In a country such as France, I think it's about as many as you have fingers on your hands. Very few are allowed, and they're much, the view is very different. And there is no standardization. For example, some of the color dyes that have been forbidden in one country are allowed in another country, and some that are allowed in that country are forbidden in the other one. It's a very chaotic situation.
I keep going back to thinking of specific foods, like fresh fruit. You know, is that a fairly safe thing, even though we know dye colors are used?
Well, dyes are not used on most fruits. They may, one dye is used on oranges in the fall of the year from the Florida area because they may appear green and still be ripe. And unfortunately, people have been conditioned to only buy the orange ones. It seems to me that the Citrus Commission should have tried to re-educate people, you know, to accepting the green color as being something that is still ripe. If none of them died, then we would accept it.
Do you think people would eat green oranges?
Oh, I think so. In the Caribbean area where the oranges are not dyed, they are green, and people do buy them on the marketplace because they're all green.
Mm-hmm.
And people have realized that they are ripe nevertheless. We have to be educated to these things.
Before, you know, when I was talking about choices, I was thinking very specifically about DES.
Yes.
And in the book you say that if DES were not used in animal feed, that it would cost about $2.30 a year per person.
Yes.
To make up for using the DES. Now,
Yes.
if I had a choice, I certainly would pay the $2.30.
Don't you think that's a great bargain to keep one more cancer-inducing substance out of the food supply? If you consider that the estimate is about $20,000 spent for a terminal cancer patient, I think $2.30 a year is really a bargain. And the $2.30 was a figure that the U.S. Department of Agriculture had estimated. Some had challenged that and thought it was a little higher, but it still is not a very great price to pay.
Let's go back to the pregnancy thing for a minute. We talk about, you know, the effect on women,
Yes.
but what about the effect on men?
In countries such as Argentina, which had banned DES many years ago, you know, in Argentina they're a very big beef-eating country. They banned it because they thought that there were dangers for the men. I suppose they felt that they might have some loss of virility.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been banned in any number of countries since then, although we still have the use of DES and a dozen and a half other hormones used in the meat supply.
Is it a risk, pregnant or not, for women?
It's always a risk for women, as Dr. Hertz pointed out when he testified at the committee hearings on DES. He said women are especially at risk because We manufacture a certain amount of estrogen in our own bodies. We eat foods which have some estrogen appearing in them naturally. And he says it's very unwise to add more burden to the body of using the estrogen in the food supply. And he pointed out that 1 out of every 16 women in this country develops breast cancer. This was several years back, and I think the statistic may be even higher now. And he felt that DES should never have been allowed to be used in the food supply. You know that back in the 1950s, the use of DES was banned with chickens. They had been implanting it in the necks of chickens. And they found that the mink were going sterile, the mink that were fed with chicken necks that still had the DES pellets in them. And that should have raised the warning signal even then, that this is a very potent, biologically potent material.
What about the packaging of foods, too? There was a minor mini scandal some time ago.
Yes, packaging is considered as a food additive legally. And of course, there are many chemicals that go into the packaging. And the PVCs, the polyvinyl chlorides, which are now greatly in the news, came into the food packaging with this rigid plastic packaging for luncheon meats and also bottles for vegetable oil. The FDA finally banned the use of this polyvinyl chloride for both of these food products because they found that there was a migration of the monomer of the PVC into these foods. But there are doubts raised about many other types of food packaging.
Like what?
Well, there is one allergist who finds that her patients can tolerate carrots, for example. And then she puts the carrots in plastic wrappings and keeps them in the refrigerator for a few days. And then she gives the patients the carrots, and they can't tolerate them. So apparently there is some migration of the plastic wrapping into the carrots. People who are sensitive to BHT and BHA, the antioxidants, have a very hard time avoiding them because sometimes these substances are incorporated in the boxes, in the packaging of packaged dry cereals. They're volatile and they go into the cereals. Or the rubber gaskets of glass jars that in which food is packaged, is the rubber itself is treated with the BHA, so it's very hard for these patients to avoid it. Or it's put into the feed of animal and it gets into the meat indirectly. So you can see how difficult this whole area is to check.
How much money is being spent on research? I mean, is there a big research push?
It's very little compared to the amount of money that's being spent on advertising. This is where a great deal of it goes. And as long as the food interests and the beverage interests keep pushing for innovation, new foods, you know, remodeling, reconstituting, reformulating, there is always going to be a lot being used for advertising because it's the same basic supplies of foods that are being used, but always reformulated into new innovations, and this we don't need.
I know you're not a nutritionist, Beatrice,
No,
and you don't
no.
like to be mistaken for one, and give, you know, wrong credentials, but aren't we being cheated a little bit nutritionally?
Very much. We are being shortchanged each time a food is highly processed because the nutritional value goes down. I would say the flavor goes down. The cost of it goes up because these are very high profit makers. And of course they also have all of the food additives. If you examine the cost of a pound of baking potatoes and then examine the cost of a pound of potato chips, you will see the big price spread. Or a pound of corn and then a pound of corn flakes. You don't buy it by the pound, but if you would figure by the pound, it's a very expensive item. It's a lot of profit in highly processed foods.
Are you hopeful? I mean, you know, I'm sure for 2 weeks now we've been sitting here saying some very depressing things.
I am hopeful in the sense that many more people are becoming enlightened, and they are seeking sources of food which do not have the additives in. And we are getting responses from food interests, more so than the government agencies, I feel, because it is hitting their pocketbooks. And if they are aware of the fact that a growing number of consumers wish to purchase foods without these questionable additives in them, the food industry will reformulate. And we are seeing many ads now for foods that are not artificially colored or flavored, or no antioxidants, no preservatives. And we are having a number of things of this sort that are beginning to appear. And I think that this is hopeful.
Is it worth marching into your supermarket and telling the manager, look, don't order this anymore, I don't want to buy this anymore, at that level, or should one go directly to the manufacturer?
I think both are important. I think that at the local level it is important to tell the supermarket manager what you will buy or what you will not buy. And also praise him when he has things in the store that you feel are good items. I think it's also very good to write letters to the processors and to comment favorably when they have put something on the market that you think is a very good product, which is additive free.
How do you find out who they are, though, to write to them?
You mean the
processors?
Well, every company must have its address on the label of the product. Sometimes the address is very vague, but it generally will get to them. We should have better labeling even with the addresses on. And I would write to the president of the company.
Start at the top, why not?
Start at the top, right.
I assume you wrote a very well-known natural food cookbook at one point, and I assume you did that as an alternative to all of this.
Yes, because I feel that if you're not going to use the highly processed foods, then you have to get back to the basics. And the basics, of course, would be the natural foods. So I feel that people do need help in that regard.
Do you really think, though, people will start cooking things from scratch?
Oh, absolutely. I have many, many people telling me now that it's so much easier for them to shop. And it does take less time to shop if you're going to choose the basics. And they are really quite surprised at the fact that it does not take long to prepare. How long does it take, really, to wash a piece of fruit and put it on the table for your dessert, or to cut a wedge of cheese? How long does it take to bake or broil fish or meat or poultry? It really isn't all time-consuming at all.
Beatrice, thank you very much. It's been 2 very informative weeks. Thank you for watching, and good night.
Woman was produced by WNED-TV, which is solely responsible for its content, and was funded by public television stations, the Ford Foundation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.